What if I told you that there exists a story so disturbing, so utterly horrifying, that it was deliberately erased from history books? A tale of a woman who survived what no human being should ever survive, only to discover that death would have been a mercy. This is not a ghost story, though she became one. This is not a fairy tale, though it involves a castle. This is the true account of Lady Marguerite de Montclair, the noblewoman who was kept alive without a face. In the winter of 1667, in the frost-covered hills of northeastern France, something happened that would challenge everything. We think we know about human cruelty and human endurance. Before we dive into this abyss of horror, let me warn you, this story will change how you see the world. It will make you question whether some fates are indeed worse than death itself. Lady Marguerite de Montclair was not supposed to survive. She was meant to die on a cold February morning, her head severed cleanly from her shoulders like so many others before her. But fate, it seems, had other plans, more twisted, more cruel plans that would transform her from a convicted adulteress into something far more terrifying, a living reminder of what happens when justice goes wrong. The story begins not with her botched execution, but 3 years earlier, in the opulent halls of Chateau de Montclair. Marguerite was 24 years old, considered one of the most beautiful women in all of France. Her portrait, painted by a student of Nicolas Poussin, showed a woman with porcelain skin, emerald eyes, and lips that seemed to hold secrets. She had been married to Count Henry de Montclair since she was 16, a political union that bound two powerful families together in an alliance of land and influence. But beauty, as we know, can be both blessing and curse. Marguerite's curse came in the form of her husband's younger brother, Philippe. Where Henry was cold and calculating, Philippe was passionate and reckless. Where Henry treated his wife like a prized possession to be displayed, Philippe saw in her a woman capable of love and desire. Their affair began in the autumn of 1664, conducted in stolen moments between hunts, in hidden chambers, behind tapestries, in the very places where medieval lovers had once whispered their forbidden promises for 2 years. Their secret remained buried. But secrets, like bodies, have a way of surfacing. A servant girl, jealous of Marguerite's beauty and power, witnessed one of their midnight encounters. The girl's testimony reached Count Henry's ears on a bitter January morning in 1660. The Count's rage was biblical in its fury. He demanded not just punishment, but public humiliation. He wanted his wife to serve as an example to every woman who dared to betray her marriage vows. Under French law, adultery was punishable by death, but Henry wanted more than legal satisfaction. He wanted spectacle. He arranged for Marguerite to be executed not in the customary private manner befitting nobility, but in the public square before the entire population of the nearby village. The execution was set for February 14, 1660, Valentine's Day. Henry's final twisted joke, the executioner chosen for this grim task, was Jacques Moreau, a man whose reputation for clean, quick beheadings had made him famous throughout the region. Moreau had performed over 200 executions in his career, and he took pride in his work. A single, decisive blow was his trademark. His victims, he claimed, never suffered. But on that frozen February morning, something went catastrophically wrong. The scaffold had been erected in the center of the village square, surrounded by hundreds of spectators who had traveled from neighboring towns to witness the fall of the beautiful adulteress. Marguerite was led to the block wearing a white chemise, her dark hair braided with white ribbons, looking more like a bride than a condemned woman. She knelt, placed her head on the block, and waited for death. Moreau raised his axe, the blade gleaming in the pale winter sun. The crowd fell silent. The axe fell. But instead of the clean severance that should have ended Marguerite's life, something went horribly wrong. Perhaps it was the cold that affected the executioner's grip. Perhaps it was the weight of the crowd's expectations. Perhaps it was divine intervention, though what God would orchestrate such cruelty remains a mystery. The axe struck, but at an angle. Instead of severing her neck, it carved away the entire front of her face. The blade tore through her forehead, obliterating her nose, lips, and chin, exposing bone and sinew beneath. Her jaw hung loose, connected only by strips of torn flesh. Her eyes, miraculously intact, stared out from a cavern of exposed skull. The crowd's cheers turned to screams of horror. Several spectators fainted, others vomited. The executioner himself dropped his axe and fled the scene, unable to complete his botched work. But Marguerite did not die. Against all medical understanding, against all logic, she remained conscious. Her body convulsed on the scaffold, blood pouring from the gaping wound where her face had been. The village physician, Dr. Etienne Beaumont, pushed through the panicking crowd and climbed onto the scaffold. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his days. Marguerite's throat had been partially severed, but not enough to cause immediate death. Her airways remained intact, allowing her to breathe through the horrific wound. Her major blood vessels had been damaged, but not completely destroyed. She was alive, but in a state that defied all natural law. Dr. Beaumont later wrote in his private journal that what he saw that day convinced him that sometimes God's mercy is far more terrifying than his wrath. The crowd demanded that the execution be completed, that someone should put the poor woman out of her misery. But Count Henry, witnessing the horror he had orchestrated, made a decision that would damn both himself and his wife to something worse than death. He ordered that Marguerite be taken to the chateau and kept alive. His reasoning, he claimed, was Christian mercy. But those who knew him understood the truth. This was punishment beyond anything legal execution could provide. Marguerite was carried to Château de Montclair in a closed carriage, her ruined face wrapped in bloodied cloth. Dr. Beaumont, the only physician willing to treat her, worked tirelessly to keep her alive. He sutured what could be sutured, cauterized what could be cauterized, and invented new medical techniques to deal with injuries no human had ever survived before. The process of keeping her alive was a torture in itself. Without lips, she could not speak properly. Without a nose, her breathing was labored and painful. Without a proper jaw, she could not eat solid food. Dr. Beaumont had to devise a system of liquid nourishment that could be poured directly into her throat through a silver tube. Every meal became a medical procedure, every breath a conscious effort. But the physical horror was nothing compared to the psychological torment that followed. When Marguerite finally regained full consciousness, 3 weeks after her botched execution, she asked for a mirror. Dr. Beaumont refused. She begged, pleaded, threatened. She tried to piece together what had happened from the reactions of those around her. The servants who brought her food would not look at her directly. The physician wore a mask that covered his own face, claiming protection from infection, but she could see the horror in his eyes. It was her husband who finally revealed the truth. Henry came to her bedside 6 weeks after the execution, accompanied by a large mirror framed in ornate gold. He placed it before her without warning, without preparation, without mercy. The sound that emerged from Marguerite's ruined throat was not quite human. It was the sound of a soul breaking, of sanity cracking under a weight too heavy for any mind to bear. Where once had been the most beautiful face in France, there was now a landscape of scars and exposed bone. Her forehead was a map of healed wounds. Her cheekbones jutted out like mountain ridges beneath stretched skin. The cavity where her nose had been was a dark hollow that led directly to her sinuses. Her mouth was a horizontal slit that could barely contain her tongue. Her eyes, still green and still beautiful, seemed to float in a face that belonged in a nightmare. But Henry was not finished with his revenge. He announced that Marguerite would remain in the chateau, alive, as a permanent reminder of the consequences of betrayal. She would be kept in the East Wing, in rooms that had once been reserved for honored guests. She would be fed, cared for, and maintained in comfort. But she would never again be seen by anyone outside the chateau walls. She would live, but she would live as a ghost. The rules of her existence were simple and absolute. She was to wear heavy veils at all times, even when alone. The windows in her chambers were to be covered with thick curtains, ensuring that she lived in perpetual twilight. She was to be fed only in complete darkness, by servants who had been sworn to secrecy. Most cruelly of all, every mirror in her wing of the chateau was to be covered or removed. She would never again see her reflection. Never again be forced to confront the horror of her survival. For the first year, Marguerite fought against these restrictions. She would tear off her veils, only to have them replaced by servants who had been instructed to ignore her protests. She would try to approach the covered windows, only to find them sealed shut. She would feel along the walls for mirrors, finding only empty frames or cloth-covered surfaces. Gradually, the fight went out of her. She began to accept her existence as a living ghost. The servants whispered about her constantly. They spoke of strange sounds emanating from her chambers at night. Sounds that might have been crying, or might have been something else entirely. They reported that she had begun talking to herself, carrying on conversations with invisible companions. Some claimed to have seen her silhouette moving behind the curtained windows. Always veiled, always alone, like a shadow trapped in amber. Dr. Beaumont continued to visit her weekly, monitoring her health and adjusting her liquid diet as needed. His journals from this period reveal a man struggling with the ethics of his own actions. He questioned whether keeping her alive was mercy or cruelty, whether his medical intervention was healing or prolonging suffering. He began to drink heavily, and his handwriting became increasingly erratic as the months passed. One entry, dated October 15, 1668, reads, "She asked me today if she dreams, or if this is the dream. I had no answer. I begin to think we are all trapped in someone else's nightmare." The isolation began to change Marguerite in ways that went beyond the physical. Servants reported that she had begun to speak in voices that were not her own, conducting elaborate conversations with people who were not there. She would address her missing lover Philippe as if he were standing beside her bed. She would argue with her husband as if he were constantly present. She would speak to her mother, who had died when Marguerite was 12, asking for forgiveness and comfort. But perhaps most disturbing of all, she began to speak to herself as if she were two different people. The servants would hear her voice, distorted by her damaged mouth, carrying on debates between the lady and the monster. The lady would plead for death, for release, for an end to the torment. The monster would argue for survival, for revenge, for a purpose to the suffering. These conversations became more frequent and more intense as her second year of imprisonment wore on. Dr. Beaumont, increasingly concerned about her mental state, began to document these episodes in detail. He noted that the monster voice seemed to grow stronger while the lady voice grew weaker. He theorized that Marguerite was creating a new identity, one that could survive what her original self could not. The physical effects of her survival were equally disturbing. Without proper facial structure, her remaining features began to shift and change. Her jawline, only partially intact, caused her remaining teeth to shift and loosen. Her cheekbones, no longer supported by the proper musculature, began to protrude more prominently. Her skin, constantly covered and deprived of sunlight, took on a pale, almost translucent quality. She began to resemble not just a ghost, but something that had never been quite human. Dr. Beaumont's final journal entry about Marguerite is dated December 20, 1670. It reads, "She no longer responds to her name. When I call her Lady Marguerite, she laughs, a sound like wind through broken glass. She tells me that Lady Marguerite died on the scaffold, that she is someone else now, something else. I fear she may be right. I fear we killed her that February morning, but forgot to let her body know." The truth of what happened to Marguerite in her final months remains largely unknown. The servants who cared for her were bound by oaths of secrecy, and most took their knowledge to their graves. What we do know comes from fragments of testimony, overheard conversations, and the increasingly disturbed writings of Dr. Beaumont. In the winter of 1671, nearly 4 years after her failed execution, strange sounds began to emanate from the east wing of Château de Montclair. The servants reported hearing what sounded like furniture being moved, heavy objects being dragged across the floor, and a voice that no longer sounded quite human. Count Henry, who had maintained his cruel vigil for all these years, finally decided to investigate. He found Marguerite's chambers empty. The heavy curtains had been torn down, revealing windows that looked out onto the castle grounds. The veils that had covered her for 4 years lay scattered on the floor like discarded snakeskins. The furniture had been arranged in strange patterns, almost ritualistic in their precision, and on the wall, written in what appeared to be blood, were the words, "The monster thanks you for setting her free." A search of the castle and grounds revealed no trace of Marguerite. The servants swore they had seen no one leave the chateau. The guards at the gates reported no unusual activity. It was as if she had simply vanished into the winter air, leaving behind only the echo of her suffering and the mystery of her disappearance. Count Henry lived for another 7 years, but those who knew him said he was never the same after that night. He became obsessed with the idea that Marguerite was still alive, still somewhere in the shadows of his estate. He would walk the halls at night, calling her name, asking for forgiveness. He installed mirrors in every room of the chateau, claiming that if she were still there, still watching, she would eventually have to see herself reflected. The chateau servants whispered of strange occurrences in the years that followed. Mirrors would be found shattered without explanation. Servants would catch glimpses of veiled figures in the corridors, only to find empty halls when they investigated. The sound of labored breathing would echo through the east wing, even though it remained unoccupied. Dr. Beaumont, the only man who truly understood the horror of what had been done to Marguerite, descended into madness. He began to see her everywhere, in every patient whose face bore scars, in every reflection that seemed slightly wrong. He died in 1675, found in his study with a mirror clutched to his chest, and the words, "I should have let her die," carved into his desk. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this story is not what happened to Marguerite Bataille, but what happened to the memory of her. Count Henry, using his considerable influence, had the records of her execution sealed. The official story became that Lady Marguerite de Montclair had died in 1667, executed for adultery. The botched execution, the years of imprisonment, the impossible survival, all of it was erased from the historical record. The executioner, Jacques Moreau, was found dead in his home 3 months after the failed execution. The official cause was given as heart failure, but those who found him reported that his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His axe, the instrument of his trade, was found buried in his garden, as if he had been trying to hide it from something or someone. The village where the execution took place was abandoned. Within 10 years, the official records claim it was due to poor harvests and economic hardship, but the local oral tradition tells a different story. The villagers spoke of a veiled figure that would appear in the square where the scaffold had stood. Always at dawn, always alone. They said she would stand there for hours, perfectly still, as if waiting for something that would never come. The scaffold itself was burned 3 days after the failed execution, but the stone platform remained. Over the years, the villagers noticed that nothing would grow on that spot. No grass, no weeds, no flowers. The stone began to crack and crumble, but the cracks formed patterns that made people uneasy. Some claimed the patterns looked like a woman's face, others like a scream, frozen in stone. As the years passed, the story of Marguerite de Montclair became legend, then myth, then almost nothing at all. But stories like this have a way of surviving, hiding in the margins of history books, whispered in the dark corners of libraries, passed down through generations of people who understand that some horrors are too terrible to be completely forgotten. In 1793, during the French Revolution, Château de Montclair was seized by the revolutionary government. The new owners, eager to erase all traces of the old aristocracy, ordered that the building be thoroughly searched and catalogued. In the east wing, behind a wall that had been sealed for over 20 years, they found a room that defied explanation. The room was filled with hundreds of mirrors, all of them broken. The walls were covered with writing, words scratched into the stone by fingernails, written in substances that might have been blood, or might have been something else. The writing was in multiple languages, French, Latin, and symbols that no one could identify. But the message, when translated, was always the same. I remember, I remember, I remember. In the center of the room, they found a collection of veils, arranged in a perfect circle. The veils were made of the finest silk, but they had been torn and stained until they resembled burial shrouds. Inside the circle, carved into the stone floor, was a single word, Marguerite. The revolutionary authorities, practical men who had no time for ghost stories, ordered that the room be sealed permanently. But the workers who were assigned to the task refused to enter. They claimed that standing in the doorway made them feel as if they were being watched by something that had no face. The room was eventually walled up from the outside, entombing its secrets behind stones and mortar. But the story doesn't end there. In 1847, a young historian named Pierre Dubois was researching the archives of the local bishop when he discovered a collection of documents that had been hidden for over a century. Among them was Dr. Beaumont's complete journal, including entries that had never before been seen. The final entry, dated 3 days before Beaumont's death, contained a revelation that changed everything we thought we knew about Marguerite's fate. Beaumont wrote, "She came to me last night, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as something alive. She thanked me for my care, for keeping her alive when death would have been mercy. She told me that she had learned to live without a face, without a name, without a place in the world. She said that she had become something new, something that could survive anything. She showed me what she had become, and I wept for the mercy of death that had been denied to her. But she did not weep. She laughed, the sound like wind through broken glass, and told me that she had found her purpose at last. She was no longer Marguerite de Montclair, the beautiful She was something else now, something that existed in the spaces between life and death, between memory and forgetting. She told me that there were others like her, others who had survived what should have killed them, others who had been transformed by suffering into something beyond human understanding. She said they were gathering, these impossible survivors, these living ghosts. She said they were patient, that they could wait as long as necessary. When I asked her what they were waiting for, she touched what remained of her face and smiled with lips that were no longer there. For the world to remember, she said. For the world to remember what it did to us, and to fear what we have become. I think I understand now why she survived. I think I understand why God, or the devil, or whatever force governs this world allowed her to live through that botched execution. She was not meant to die. She was meant to become something else, something that could serve as a warning to those who would inflict such cruelty on their fellow human beings. But I fear that warning will go unheeded. I fear that the world will continue to create monsters like her, will continue to push people beyond the boundaries of human endurance, will continue to believe that some fates are deserved. If you are reading this, if these words survive when I do not remember Lady Marguerite de Montclair, remember that she was once beautiful, once loved, once human. Remember that she was transformed not by magic or curse, but by the deliberate cruelty of those who should have protected her. Remember that she survived when she should have died, and that survival changed her into something the world had never seen before. And remember that she is still out there, somewhere in the shadows between life and death, still waiting, still remembering, still hoping that someone will understand the true horror of what was done to her. For in the end, the most terrifying thing about Marguerite de Montclair is not that she became a monster. It is that she was made into one by people who believed themselves to be righteous, by people who thought they were administering justice, by people who could not imagine that their actions would create something far worse than any crime they sought to punish. She is our creation, our responsibility, our sin made manifest, and somewhere, in the darkness between heartbeats, she is still alive, still waiting, still remembering what we did to her. God help us all. Pierre Dubois published his findings in a small academic journal, but the story attracted little attention. The French academic establishment of the mid-19th century had no interest in tales of impossible survival and supernatural revenge. The few scholars who did take notice dismissed the story as folklore, a cautionary tale invented by superstitious villagers, but Dubois was not satisfied with academic dismissal. He traveled to the ruins of Château de Montclair, which had been abandoned since the revolution. The local villagers warned him not to enter the East Wing, but he ignored their superstitions. He was, after all, a modern man, a man of science and reason. Dubois spent 3 days in the chateau, documenting everything he found. His notes describe rooms filled with the detritus of aristocratic life, faded tapestries, broken furniture, portraits with their faces scratched out. But when he reached the sealed room that had been discovered in 1793, he found something that challenged his rationale. Worldview. The wall that had been built to seal the room had been torn down from the inside. The stones lay scattered across the floor, arranged in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The room itself was exactly as the revolutionary authorities had described it: mirrors, writing veils arranged in a circle. But there was something new, something that hadn't been there before. In the center of the circle of veils, standing perfectly still, was a figure wrapped in heavy black cloth. The figure was tall, taller than any woman should be, and thin in a way that suggested bones without flesh. The cloth that covered it was not quite opaque, allowing glimpses of something underneath that might have been skin, or might have been something else entirely. Dubois later wrote that he stood in that doorway for what felt like hours, watching the figure, waiting for it to move, but it remained perfectly still, like a statue carved from shadow. He called out, asking if anyone was there, but received no response. He stepped into the room, his footsteps echoing strangely in the space, and approached the figure. As he drew closer, he could see that the cloth was not simply draped over the figure, but seemed to be part of it, as if it had grown from the skin. Beneath, the fabric was old, older than it should have been, and it moved slightly in a breeze that Dubois could not feel. He reached out to touch it, and the figure finally moved. It turned toward him, and Dubois saw what lay beneath the cloth. He saw the ruin of a face, the landscape of scars and exposed bone that had once been beautiful. But more than that, he saw eyes that held the accumulated weight of centuries, eyes that had seen too much and remembered everything. The figure spoke, and its voice was like wind through broken glass. "You have found me," it said. "You have remembered." Dubois fled the chateau that night, leaving behind his notes and his equipment. He never returned to complete his research, never published his findings about what he had discovered in that sealed room. He spent the rest of his life in a small village in the south of France, working as a schoolteacher and never speaking of his experience at Château de Montclair. But the story of Marguerite de Montclair did not end with Dubois's flight. In the decades that followed, other researchers, other curious individuals, made their way to the ruined chateau. Most found nothing but empty rooms and faded memories. But a few, a very few, reported encounters that defied explanation. Spoke of a figure in the East Wing, always veiled, always silent, always watching. They reported conversations with something that claimed to be the ghost of a woman who had died without dying, who had been transformed by suffering into something beyond human understanding. They described a presence that seemed to exist in the spaces between life and death, between memory and forgetting. The chateau was finally demolished in 1923, but the demolition crews reported strange difficulties. Tools would disappear overnight, only to be found arranged in patterns that no one could explain. Workers would hear voices in rooms that had already been torn down. The foreman, a practical man who had supervised dozens of demolitions, reported that the East Wing seemed to resist destruction, as if the very stones remembered what had happened there. When the demolition was finally complete, the site was left. Empty plans were made to build a new structure, but every architect who visited the site reported the same thing. They felt as if they were being watched by something that had no face. The project was eventually abandoned, and the site was turned into a small park. But even now, in the 21st century, the story of Marguerite de Montclair continues to surface. Urban explorers claim to have found rooms beneath the park that match the descriptions of her chambers. Paranormal investigators report encounters with a veiled figure who speaks of suffering and transformation. Historians occasionally discover documents that reference a noblewoman who survived her own execution. only to become something that existed outside the normal boundaries of life and death. The truth about Marguerite de Montclair may never be fully known. The historical record is fragmentary. The witnesses are long dead, and the chateau that housed her suffering has been reduced to dust. But the story persists, passed down through generations of people who understand that some horrors are too terrible to be completely forgotten. What we do know is this: in 1867, a woman named Marguerite de Montclair was meant to die. She was meant to pay for her adultery with her life, to serve as an example to others who might be tempted to betray their marriage vows. But something went wrong, and instead of dying, she was transformed into something that challenged everything we think we know about life, death, and the space between them. She became a living ghost, a woman without a face, a being who existed in the shadows between memory and forgetting. She was kept alive by the very cruelty that was meant to kill her, sustained by suffering that should have destroyed her. And somewhere, in the darkness between heartbeats, she may still be alive, still waiting, still remembering what was done to her. The story of Marguerite de Montclair is not just a ghost story or a historical curiosity. It is a reminder of what happens when justice becomes revenge, when punishment becomes torture, when human beings are pushed beyond the boundaries of what they can endure. It is a warning about the monsters we create when we forget that even the guilty deserve mercy, that even the condemned deserve death with dignity. But perhaps most importantly, it is a testament to the power of human survival, to the terrible strength that can emerge from the most impossible circumstances. Marguerite de Montclair survived what no one should survive, endured what no one should endure, and became something that the world had never seen before. She was transformed by suffering into something beyond human understanding, but she was also transformed by the refusal to surrender, by the determination to exist, even when existence had become unbearable. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying thing of all. Not that she became a monster, but that she remained, in some essential way, human. That somewhere beneath the scars and the suffering, beneath the veils and the silence, there remained a woman who remembered what it felt like to be beautiful, to be loved, to be alive. She is still out there, somewhere in the shadows between life and death, still waiting, still remembering, still hoping that someone will understand the true horror of what was done to her. And perhaps, if we listen carefully, if we look beyond the surface of the story, we can still hear her voice, like wind through broken glass, asking the question that has haunted her for centuries. If you could not let me die, what exactly did you make me live for? That question echoes through the centuries, demanding an answer that none of us may be prepared to give. For in the end, the story of Marguerite de Montclair is not just her story. It is ours. It is a reflection of our capacity for both cruelty and mercy, our ability to create monsters, and our responsibility to those we have destroyed. She was the noblewoman who was kept alive without a face, the woman who survived her own execution only to discover that some fates are indeed worse than death. She was transformed by suffering into something that existed outside the normal boundaries of human experience. But she was also transformed by the refusal to surrender, by the determination to exist even when existence had become unbearable. And somewhere, in the darkness between heartbeats, she is still alive, still waiting, still remembering what we did to her, still hoping that someone, someday, will understand the true horror of survival without mercy, of life without the possibility of peace, of existence without the comfort of death. The story of Marguerite de Montclair is a reminder that some horrors are too terrible to be forgotten, that some suffering is too profound to be healed, that some transformations are too complete to be undone. It is a testament to the power of human endurance and a warning about the monsters we create when we push people beyond the boundaries of what they can bear. But most of all, it is a question that demands an answer, a challenge that we must face. What do we owe to those we have destroyed? What responsibility do we bear for the monsters we have created? And what hope is there for redemption when the very act of survival becomes a form of damnation? These are the questions that Marguerite de Montclair asks from the shadows the questions that echo through the centuries, demanding answers that none of us may be prepared to give, for in the end, her story is not just about one woman's impossible survival. It is about all of us, about the choices we make and the consequences we must live with, about the monsters we create and the responsibility we bear for their existence. She was kept alive without a face, but she was also kept alive without mercy, without hope, without the possibility of peace. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying thing of all. Not that she became a monster, but that she remained, in some essential way, human. That somewhere beneath the scars and the suffering, there remained a woman who remembered what it felt like to be whole. And so the story continues, passed down through generations of people who understand that some horrors are too terrible to be completely forgotten. The noblewoman who was kept alive without a face lives on, not just in the historical record, but in the dark corners of our collective memory, reminding us of what we are capable of, both in terms of cruelty and endurance. Her legacy is written, not in stone or parchment, but in the shadows between life and death, in the spaces where memory and forgetting intersect, in the terrible understanding that some fates are indeed worse than death itself. She is a reminder that survival is not always a blessing, that life is not always preferable to death, that the human capacity for endurance can sometimes be the cruelest gift of all. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Marguerite de Montclair, that in our quest for justice, we must remember mercy, that in our desire for punishment, we must not forget compassion, that in our determination to make others pay for their crimes, we must not lose sight of our own humanity. For if we do, we risk creating monsters far worse than any we seek to punish. We risk becoming the very thing we claim to oppose. We risk transforming ourselves into something that exists outside the boundaries of human decency, something that can inflict suffering without conscience, something that can destroy lives without remorse. The noblewoman who is kept alive without a face serves as a warning to us all. She reminds us that the line between justice and vengeance is thinner than we might like to believe, that the difference between punishment and torture is often a matter of degree rather than kind, that the monsters we create often reflect our own capacity for evil. But she also reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, even when all hope seems lost, the human spirit can endure. That even when we are transformed by suffering into something unrecognizable, something essential remains. That even when we are kept alive without faces, without names, without places in the world, we continue to exist, to remember, to hope. And perhaps, that is the most important lesson of all. Not that we are capable of creating monsters, but that we are responsible for the monsters we create. Not that suffering can transform us into something inhuman, but that our humanity persists even in the face of the most inhuman treatment. Not that some fates are worse than death, but that even in those fates, there remains the possibility of meaning, of purpose, of connection to something larger than ourselves. The story of Marguerite de Montclair is a dark one, filled with horror and suffering and transformation, but it is also a story of survival, of endurance, of the refusal to surrender, even when surrender would be mercy. It is a story that challenges us to examine our own capacity for both cruelty and compassion, our own responsibility for the monsters we create, our own obligation to those we have destroyed. And in the end, it is a story that reminds us that, even in the darkest corners of history, even in the most terrible circumstances, there remains something worth remembering, something worth honoring, something worth learning from. The noblewoman who is kept alive without a face may have become a monster, but she also became a testament to the indestructible nature of human consciousness. Even when that consciousness becomes something we can barely recognize as human. But there is one final chapter to this story. One last revelation that changes everything we thought we knew about Marguerite de Montclair and her impossible survival. In 1998, during renovation work at what had once been the village where her execution took place, construction workers uncovered something that had been buried for over 3 centuries. Beneath the foundations of what had been the village church, they found a chamber that appeared to be much older than the building above it. The chamber was small, barely large enough for a single person, and its walls were covered with the same strange writing that had been found in the sealed room of Château de Montclair. But this writing was different. It was more recent, dating to sometime in the late 18th century, and it told a story that no one had ever imagined. The writing, when finally translated by a team of medieval scholars, revealed that Marguerite de Montclair had not simply disappeared from the chateau. In 1671, she had returned to the place where her transformation had begun, to the spot where the executioner's blade had failed to grant her the mercy of death. She had come back to wait. The chamber contained evidence of long habitation. There were the remains of a crude bed, containers that had once held food and water, and hundreds of candles that had burned down to mere stubs. But most disturbing of all were the mirrors. The walls of the chamber were lined with broken mirrors, just like those found in the chateau, but these mirrors were different. They had been arranged in a specific pattern, forming a complex geometric design that seemed to focus all reflections toward a single point in the center of the room. At that focal point, carved into the stone floor, was a message that defied understanding. It read, "I have learned to see myself in the spaces between reflections. I have learned to exist in the moments between heartbeats. I have learned to love the face that was taken from me. I am complete." The implications of this discovery were staggering. It suggested that Marguerite de Montclair had not simply survived her botched execution and subsequent imprisonment, but had somehow achieved a form of transcendence through her suffering. She had found a way to exist outside the normal boundaries of human experience, to become something that was both more and less than human. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the discovery was what the archaeologists found in the deepest part of the chamber. Hidden beneath loose stones, they uncovered a collection of items that appeared to be offerings or tributes. There were locks of hair, pieces of jewelry, scraps of fabric, and dozens of small mirrors, all arranged with ritualistic precision. Each item was accompanied by a small piece of parchment bearing a name and a date. The names were those of women from all over Europe, spanning a period of nearly 2 centuries. The dates corresponded to records of executions, disappearances, and unexplained deaths. It appeared that Marguerite de Montclair had become something more than a solitary monster. She had become a focal point for others like her, others who had survived what should have killed them, others who had been transformed by suffering into something beyond human understanding. The discovery suggested that there was an entire network of these impossible survivors, these living ghosts who existed in the spaces between life and death. They were women who had been pushed beyond the boundaries of human endurance, who had survived tortures and executions and transformations that should have destroyed them, who had become something that the world was not prepared to acknowledge or understand. And they were all connected to Marguerite de Montclair, the first of their kind, the woman who had shown them that it was possible to exist even when existence had become unbearable. She had become their patron saint, their guide, their example of what could be achieved through the refusal to surrender to death. The chamber was sealed again after the discovery, and the findings were classified by the French government. The official reason given was concern about public safety, about the potential for the site to become a focus for dangerous cults or extremist groups. But those who had seen the evidence understood the real reason for the secrecy. The truth about Marguerite de Montclair and her followers was too disturbing, too challenging to accepted notions of reality, too dangerous to be made public. Because if the evidence was real, if the chamber and its contents were authentic, then it meant that there were others like her still out there, others who had survived the unspeakable, who had been transformed by suffering into something that existed outside the normal boundaries of human experience, others who waited in the shadows, in the spaces between life and death, in the moments between heartbeats. And that possibility, that terrifying prospect, was too much for the rational world to accept. So the chamber was sealed, the evidence was classified, and the story of Marguerite de Montclair was once again relegated to the realm of legend and myth. But legends and myths have a way of persisting, of surfacing in unexpected places, of demanding to be heard. And the story of the noblewoman who was kept alive without a face continues to echo through the centuries. A reminder of what we are capable of, both in terms of cruelty and endurance. She was transformed by suffering into something that challenged everything we think we know about life and death, about justice and mercy, about the nature of human existence itself. She became a living ghost, a woman without a face, a being who existed in the shadows between memory and forgetting. But she also became something more, a symbol of survival, of endurance, of the refusal to surrender, even when surrender would be mercy. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. Not that we are capable of creating monsters, but that even monsters can find meaning in their existence. Not that suffering can transform us into something inhuman, but that our humanity persists even in the face of the most inhuman treatment. Not that some fates are worse than death, but that even in those fates, there remains the possibility of transcendence, of transformation, of becoming something greater than what we were before. The noblewoman who was kept alive without a face serves as a reminder that the human spirit is capable of enduring anything, of surviving even the most impossible circumstances, of finding purpose and meaning even in the darkest corners of existence. She reminds us that even when we are stripped of everything that makes us human, even when we are transformed into something unrecognizable, something essential remains, and that something, that indestructible core of human consciousness, is what allows us to transcend our circumstances, to find meaning in our suffering, to become something greater than the sum of our traumas. It is what allowed Marguerite de Montclair to survive her botched execution, to endure her imprisonment, to transform her suffering into something that could guide and inspire others. She was kept alive without a face, but she was also kept alive without hope, without mercy, without the possibility of peace. And yet, she found a way to exist, to endure, to become something that the world had never seen before. She became a testament to the power of human survival. A reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, even when all seems lost, there remains the possibility of transcendence. The story of Marguerite de Montclair is a dark one, filled with horror and suffering and transformation. But it is also a story of hope, of endurance, of the triumph of the human spirit over the most impossible circumstances. It is a story that challenges us to examine our own capacity for both cruelty and compassion, our own responsibility for the monsters we create, our own obligation to those we have destroyed. And in the end, it is a story that reminds us that, even in the face of the most inhuman treatment, even when we are pushed beyond the boundaries of what we can endure, there remains something indestructible within us, something that allows us to survive, to endure, to find meaning in our existence even when that existence has become unbearable. The noblewoman who was kept alive, without a face, may have been transformed into something that existed outside the normal boundaries of human experience. But she was also transformed into something that could inspire others, that could guide them through their own impossible circumstances, that could show them that survival is possible even when survival seems impossible. And that, perhaps, is the most profound lesson of all. Not that we are capable of inflicting unimaginable suffering, but that we are also capable of surviving it. Not that we can be transformed into monsters, but that we can also be transformed into something greater than what we were before. Not that some fates are worse than death, but that even in those fates, there remains the possibility of finding meaning, of creating purpose, of becoming something that the world has never seen before. The story of Marguerite de Montclair continues to echo through the centuries, a reminder of both the worst and the best of human nature. She was a victim of unimaginable cruelty, but she was also a survivor of impossible circumstances. She was transformed into something that challenged everything we think we know about human existence. But she was also transformed into something that could inspire and guide others, and somewhere in the darkness between heartbeats, in the spaces between life and death, she may still be waiting, still remembering, still hoping that someone will understand the true meaning of her story. Not just the horror of what was done to her, but the triumph of what she became despite it. Not just the cruelty of her fate, but the strength she found to endure it. Not just the monster she was made into, but the guide she became for others, who faced similar, impossible circumstances. She was the noblewoman who was kept alive without a face. But she was also the woman who learned to see herself in the spaces between reflections, who learned to exist in the moments between heartbeats, who learned to love the face that was taken from her. She was a victim who became a survivor, a monster who became a guide, a woman who became something that the world had never seen before and may never see again. And that is her legacy. Her gift to us across the centuries, the understanding that, even in the darkest circumstances, even when all hope seems lost, there remains the possibility of transcendence, of transformation, of becoming something greater than what we were before. She reminds us that the human spirit is capable of enduring anything, of surviving even the most impossible circumstances, of finding purpose and meaning even in the darkest corners of existence. The story of Marguerite de Montclair is one that will continue to be told, to be whispered in the dark corners of history, to be passed down through generations of people who understand that some truths are too important to be forgotten. She was kept alive without a face, but she was also kept alive as a testament to the indestructible nature of human consciousness. As a reminder that even when we are stripped of everything that makes us human, something essential remains. And that something, that indestructible core of what makes us who we are, is what allows us to transcend our circumstances, to find meaning in our suffering, to become something greater than the sum of our traumas. It is what allowed Marguerite de Montclair to survive the unsurvivable, to endure the unendurable, to become something that continues to inspire and challenge us centuries after her impossible survival. She was the noblewoman who was kept alive, without a face, the woman who survived her own execution only to discover that some fates are indeed worse than death. But she was also the woman who learned to find meaning in that fate, who transformed her suffering into something that could guide and inspire others, who became a testament to the power of human endurance and the possibility of transcendence, even in the darkest circumstances. And that, in the end, is what makes her story so powerful, so enduring, so impossible to forget. It is not just a tale of horror and suffering, but a story of survival and transcendence, of the triumph of the human spirit over the most impossible circumstances. It is a reminder that even when we are kept alive without faces, without names, without places in the world, we continue to exist, to remember, to hope, to become something greater than what we were before. The noblewoman who was kept alive without a face lives on, not just in the historical record, but in the understanding that the human capacity for endurance is limitless, that the power of survival can transform even the most impossible circumstances into something meaningful, something purposeful, something that can inspire and guide others through their own darkest moments. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, even when we are pushed beyond the boundaries of what we can endure, there remains within us something indestructible, something that allows us to survive, to endure, to find meaning in our existence, even when that existence has become unbearable. She was kept alive without a face, but she was also kept alive as a reminder that the human spirit is capable of transcending any circumstance, of finding purpose in any suffering, of becoming something greater than any trauma. And that reminder, that testament to the power of human endurance, continues to echo through the centuries, challenging us to examine our own capacity for both cruelty and compassion, our own responsibility for the monsters we create, our own obligation to those we have destroyed. The story of Marguerite de Montclair is far from over. It continues to be written in the shadows between life and death, in the spaces where memory and forgetting intersect, in the terrible understanding that some fates are indeed worse than death itself, but also in the profound realization that even those fates can be transformed into something meaningful, something purposeful, something that can inspire and guide others through their own impossible circumstances. She was the noblewoman who was kept alive without a face, But she was also the woman who learned to see herself in ways that no one had ever imagined, who learned to exist in spaces that no one had ever explored, who learned to love what she had become despite everything that had been taken from her. And that transformation, that transcendence, that triumph of the human spirit over the most impossible circumstances, is what makes her story not just a tale of horror, but a testament to the indestructible nature of human consciousness and the limitless power of survival. In the end, we are all faced with the question that Marguerite de Montclair asked from the shadows: if you could not let me die, what exactly did you make me live for? And perhaps the answer is this: to remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, even when all hope seems lost, there remains the possibility of transcendence, of transformation, of becoming something greater than what we were before. Lived to show us that the human spirit is capable of enduring anything, of surviving even the most impossible circumstances, of finding purpose and meaning even in the darkest corners of existence. And that, ultimately, is the legacy of the Noblewoman, who was kept alive without a face, not just a story of horror and suffering, but a testament to the power of human endurance. A reminder of our capacity for transcendence, and a challenge to never forget that even in the face of the most inhuman treatment, something essentially human remains, something that allows us to survive, to endure, to become something greater than the sum of our traumas. Her story continues to echo through the centuries, a dark melody that reminds us of both the worst and the best of human nature, a haunting refrain that challenges us to examine our own capacity for both cruelty and compassion, our own responsibility for the monsters we create, our own obligation to remember those we have destroyed and to learn from their impossible survival. She was kept alive without a face, but she was also kept alive as a reminder that the human spirit is indestructible, that the power of survival can transform even the most impossible circumstances into something meaningful, and that even when we are stripped of everything that makes us human, something essential remains, something that allows us to transcend our circumstances and become something greater than what we were before. The Noblewoman, who was kept alive without a face, will continue to haunt the shadows of history, a reminder that some stories are too important to be forgotten, that some truths are too powerful to be ignored, that some transformations are too profound to be undone. She will continue to wait in the darkness between heartbeats, in the spaces between life and death, ready to remind us that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, the human spirit endures, survives, and ultimately transcends.